Hello everybody, and this video is on the short answer question, or the SAQ, and we're going to break down the forms of the SAQ, see how it appears on the test, look to see how they're graded, and in turn how we would teach that. So just as a reminder, here's where it exists on the AP test. So once the students finish the multiple choice questions, those questions are collected and then they go to the short answer questions. They have to answer 3 of these questions in 40 minutes. Now, it's important to note that the SAQs come in 3 different forms, so there are 3 different styles. The first SAQ will always have a quotation from a secondary source. It will always be the writing of a historian, and students will have to read it and then engage in it in some way with letters A, B, and C. So Style 1 question is a secondary source. Now, I just want to note that students should label their answers when they answer the SAQ. That's very important. As a grader for SAQs last year, it was very helpful for me. I think it helps students organize their thoughts, but also, in my experience reading, students who label the answers tend to do better on them. I think because it helps them focus on the individual tasks of the question. So I always expect my students to label the answers A, B, and C. Also note the verbs being used. This is a very typical SAQ here, where the verb in A is identify, the verb in B and C is both explain. And that's pretty much the garden variety. That doesn't mean everyone's going to be like that, but most SAQs are like that. And they spiral in difficulty. In other words, A is pretty easy to get because all they have to do is make an identification of a piece of content in a complete sentence. B requires them to make an identification as well, but they have to add some explanatory power to that. So explain means identify, but also explain how or why. Now that analysis of how or why does not have to be as developed as it is on the DBQ or the LEQ, but it does have to be there when they see the word explain. And on this particular one, C asks them to explain as well. And typically C would be a little more difficult than B. So they spiral in difficulty from A being, let's say, your entry-level question that most people should be able to get, B a little bit more difficult, and typically, but not always, C is a step up from B. So this is SAQ Style 1. It's a mandatory question for students to answer. They'll have 13 minutes to answer this. Now, here is the next style. The second SAQ that students will write, Type 2, requires students to engage with a visual stimuli. So this is SAQ 2 from last year's AP World History test. Note this one has a data chart, so students need to analyze that data and use it in their responses. I remember this question last year. The AP Human students, the students who had previously had AP Human Geography, killed this question because it's the type of data that they're used to in that AP course. Now here's another example of the same type of question, Type 2. This is from 2018, I believe. Here there's a piece of art. Again, it's a visual stimuli, and students need to look at the picture and answer A, B, and C. Now on a work of art such as this, notice the attribution line underneath the picture. That is always extremely important. It's like the source line on a document in a DBQ. It provides necessary content. It's not there just to give them bibliographic information about the picture. It actually supplies important content. And sometimes it can be just as important as looking at the picture. So once students complete the second SAQ, which will always have a visual stimuli, they'll look to SAQ 3 and 4, and here they have a choice. These are called non-stimulated SAQs. They do not have any source material. Students simply answer A, B, and C straight up, and they choose either 3 or 4. They do one of these. So 40 minutes to write 3, that's roughly a little over 13 minutes a piece to write these questions. Now, to help you remember this, I created this handy-dandy SAQ reminder sheet, and I will link it in the description down here, and it gives you the basic verbs used, and it gives you the basic structure of the 3 different types of SAQs. Now, to understand these questions a little bit better, let's look at an SAQ that I gave my students. The last one I gave them this school year, we had already gone to distance or online learning, and they had to do this SAQ. So look at it. It's obviously the third type of SAQ where they have a choice between one of the two. There's no stimulus. They simply straight up answer the question. So A says identify a non-aligned nation that emerged after the Second World War. All they need to do is name the country, but it has to be in a complete sentence. Now, something that's true of all of these items, A, B, and C, is that theoretically, and sometimes in actuality, they can be answered with one well-written sentence, especially A. But even B and C can be answered in a single well-written sentence. Now, I don't tell my students that because what they hear is all you have to do is write one sentence for each of these. But nevertheless, these are not essays. It's not a short essay question. It's a short answer question. So I gave this to my students, and one student responded such. For A, he put non-aligned equals India. Now that content is true, but he does not get the point here. He should have known this by the end of the year, but there's no point here because it's not a complete sentence. Nothing on the written portions of the AP test are considered if they're not complete sentences. In the middle of an essay, if a student starts to bullet something, it's not counted. It has to be a sentence. In fact, you know what would have worked here? The least a student could write for this and get the answer is if they would have written, "It's India." It is India. That's a complete sentence. That would actually get the point. Now, I don't encourage my students to write in such a minimalistic way, but that's a sentence and it has the correct answers. They could have put a non-aligned nation after the Second World War was Egypt. That would probably be a better answer, but a point is a point. So this does not get the answer. It's a thumbs down. There's no sympathy at the reading. You can't say, well, the student knew so much. We don't do that, so this is not an answer. Let's look on to what another student wrote. This gave a little bit more. This is a sentence. The student wrote, after World War II, global politics was divided into two groups, those nations who followed the United States and nations who followed the Soviet Union. That's true, and this would count for A. All this student has done is identified a transformation of global politics. They didn't explain it. Just because one event follows another and they're consecutive, you have not explained causation. So this does not get the point. Remember, B requires him to explain how World War II transformed global politics. They can't simply say here was a change that occurred after World War II. So we don't take that. Here's another example. After World War II, the United States became a major global power. This can be seen in the Suez Crisis. Great Britain was shown to be weak in Egypt, and the United States demonstrated its rise to dominance in terms of world power. This does the same thing the previous one did, but gives a little more detail. So this doesn't work. I know exactly where they got this content. I have podcast content out, and this is exactly how I explained this in the podcast, that the Suez Crisis was really the event that showed that Britain was no longer the preeminent power in the world. The U.S. had kind of eclipsed them. So that's where the student got it. But no, this doesn't count because there's no explanatory power here. So remember, the bar from A to B goes up significantly, and there is no point here. So let's look at another one. Now, when I was grading these, as soon as I saw that first sentence, or actually those first 4 words, damaged by the war, I knew this student was going to get the point because they're beginning with the war. Let's look at what she wrote. Damaged by the war, in economic crisis and experiencing the loss of its colonies as independence movements became more widespread, Britain no longer stood at the top of the political hierarchy. Instead, the United States and the Soviet Union rose to fill the vacuum, especially with the U.S.'s wealth from World War I and World War II, as they exported goods and did not have damaged infrastructure since neither war was fought on U.S. soil. You know, there are many things in here that would have earned the point by themselves. Any connection to the war in a cause and effect way that explains the transformation of global politics would get the point here. This is an extremely well-written, thorough answer. So we're going to change things up a little bit. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you another SAQ. It's a type 2 SAQ, so it has a visual stimuli. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the ABC prompts and we're going to look at what students wrote on this. And what I want you to do is I want you to pause after I show you a student response, and I want you to try to determine whether or not you think it should get the point. And then once you've determined that, once you've kind of scored it, so to speak, then hit play, and we'll talk about each of the student responses here. So here it is. Notice this has two charts. The first thing a student should do is look at the label of the charts. Chart 1 says population of the Americas, and the other one is the population of Africa, and the date range is there. They look at these charts. Here we have A, B, and C, and they analyze the charts to answer those. So let's look at the first SAQ item. A says, for the period 1500 to 1700, explain one factor behind the population changes in chart 1. Now, it's extremely important that students parse these prompts out. I like them to write directly on the test when I give them. I like them to circle keywords and operative verbs. Did you notice that each of these questions said explain? It didn't go identify, explain, explain. And when I gave this in class, the student said, well, on the first one, I thought all you had to do was identify. I said, no, you do whatever the verb says. They don't always follow the norm or the garden variety, so to speak. So if it says explain on A, B, and C, you better do that. Also note that this item requires the students to respond to only a portion of the years in the chart. That's very important. They should underline 1500 to 1700 to circle that, or 1500 to 1750. So I'm going to show you a student response to this. And I want you to pause and just think for a minute. You kind of grade it and determine whether or not you would give it a point. Now, you have to remember, these are binary decisions. You can't say, well, it was kind of half good, so I'll give it half a point. It's 1 or 0 for A, B, and C. And by the way, every SAQ has a score of 3. So they write 3. That's 9 points. And those 9 points constitutes 20% of the total AP exam grade. So here's the first student response. Okay, so I hope you did not give this the point. There has to be something that explicitly talks about a change in population, explains it. The fact that the Americas were discovered in 1492 and still being settled, that doesn't count. Settlers also had to contend with disgruntled Native Americans, but the population did increase slightly. No, we're not going to give that the point. So let's go on to another student response to this. This is to the same question here. The period is 1500 to 1750, and here's a student response. And this one does get the point. It brings up the death of millions of natives in the Americas, and that is a true fact, but it says as a result of European conquest. I personally would have liked to have seen this student go a little bit beyond that and maybe talk about the Europeans introducing diseases. But when this SAQ was given, and this is a piloted SAQ, they did award the point here. And I want to mention something. Don't hesitate to grade harder in your class than you think they will at the AP exam, because they change the scoring standards a little bit every year to norm each test from year to year. So if a student made a 4 on the 2019 test, they would want that student to make a 4 on all AP tests. So they have to slightly float up or down the standards every year to create consistency across the grading. So sometimes when you get scores back, look at scoring guides and graded essays, you'll think, why in the world did that item get a point? I would have never done that in class. Well, don't do that in class. It's better for them to take the AP test and feel it was much easier than the test that you give in your class. So I don't know that I would have given this the point in class, but it did get it. So let's move on to another one. Now you note a change here, and students really need to catch this. We've moved from A to B, and B talks about a different date range. It talks about, or refers to the dates 1750 to 1900. So here's a student response, and pause it and see what you think about it. Okay, so we are not going to give this the point. Settlers finally settling the whole country does not necessitate a change in population. It could just be a different dispersal of demography. Also, the Louisiana Purchase, that's just a land increase. I mean, if I buy the lot next to my house, that doesn't mean the number of people in my family went up. No, we're not going to give this the point. If you want to pause that and read the scoring guide there, you can. We're going to go into the next question. This is for B as well, the same question, period 1750 to 1900, and here's the student response. A lot of new teachers wonder about this one. This is the one that sometimes people say, well, I kind of give it half a point, because that part at the end, the rising nations of Canada and the United States, throws people off. But this is a good place to bring up the type of scoring done on AP tests. It's called asset scoring, and that means you only score for things that are true. If a student writes something that's just absolutely false, it doesn't count against them. Only things that are true count and can't be lost once obtained. So this gets the point, because it talks about a change in population. It says this is a direct result of Europeans settling and living in the Americans. Because he said Europeans settling, that implies a migration. Unlike the last response, the student did not write Americas were still being settled. He said Europeans were settling, so they had to have crossed an ocean. That means there was an increase in population. So what they put about the rising nations of Canada and the United States is not true. It doesn't work, but it won't alter the fact that this student has already earned this point. It's just ignored by the reader. So let's look at another response here. This one is C. Notice on this that it jumps to the other graph. It's no longer talking about the Americans. It's talking about the population of Africa, and this one includes the whole date range, 1500 to 1900. And here's a student response. And this one does not get the point. It identified, but it didn't explain. They could have taken European imperialism and developed that a little bit more, added an explanatory component to this sentence, but they did not. Here is the scoring guide. So we'll look at one more for the same question. I hope you see the difference between this and the previous one, because this definitely gets the point. Matter of fact, only one of those explanations would have been sufficient to give the point. Increased knowledge in disease prevention, which prevented deaths, and it greatly reduced the slave trade, which increased births. Either of those are explanations that lead to a change in population, as seen in that chart, so that works very well. So we're going to end the video with something different. I'm going to put up an SAQ Style 2, which has two maps. And in the description to this video, you're going to see the prompt. I did not put those together because this is an SAQ that's still behind the audit wall. It's not supposed to go public, so I don't want it all in one place, because this video will be private and I'll probably take the links down. But what I want you to do is look at the two maps for this SAQ. Look in the description and you'll see the prompt, and you can print that out or just look at it. And I want you to attempt to write this. Here are the two maps. The attribution at the top is very important. You have trade routes here. Look at the dates. And then you have a second map. And by the way, I'll put them both up at the end. You can see them at the same time. Here's the second one. The date has changed. Again, the attribution line is very important. And here they both are. So if you would go down and look at the prompt and write A, B, and C, and only after you've done that, look at the other link, which is the scoring guide. It shows the most common answers that would have gained the points for A, B, and C. Understand that these scoring guides we get don't show every conceivable or possible answer. They just show the most common ones. So you don't have to have had one of those specific examples, but they give you the parameter, so to speak, on what was accepted for this. So go ahead, after you've written it, look at the scoring guide, and I will see you guys live tomorrow morning.